Not a single breath disturbed the crystalline dust of the arena. In the center of the devastation stood Captain Kalen Thorne, his heavy boot pressed firmly against the chest of Archon Malachur. A crude slab of gray metal rested inches from the glowing noble's throat. To the linked minds of the adjudicators watching from the gallery, this silent tableau defied all known logic. A primitive had just shattered an immortal. You'll want to hear how one man broke an empire without throwing a single punch. Trust me on that. 72 hours earlier, the greatest threat to the luminary hegemony had been a disagreement over reception banners. High above Aurelia Prime, Kalen had docked his battered frigate at the floating palace. The court expected a barbarian. They prepared for a loud, blundering beast. Instead, the human walked down the docking ramp in complete silence. His thumb tapped a slow, steady rhythm against his thigh seam. Vale and the other adjudicators floating in the observation tiers shared a wave of smug, telepathic amusement. A nervous twitch, the creature was already terrified. Through the gilded corridors he was escorted. Glowing guards flanked him, their movements fluid and weightless, while Kalen's heavy footfalls echoed like hammer strikes. Princess Lyra of the Ethelgard walked beside him, her psionic signature pulled tight with unspoken warning. "They will probe for any fracture in your psyche," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the ambient hum of the crystal floors. "Do not let them see your ghosts." They demanded a spectacle. Within the grand reception hall, the provocations started immediately. Archon Malachur drifted downward from his levitating dais, his form radiating an aura of blinding, condescending light. Not with sound did the Archon speak, but through a psychic projection specifically designed to induce intense vertigo in lesser species. Detailing the three trials of mind, body, and spirit, he effectively isolated the human from his crew and allies. Kalen merely adjusted his collar. "Is there a schedule for these events, or do we just stand around?" he asked quietly. Across the network, Vale felt the collective confusion of her peers. The human's mind was an absolute dead zone, a true psionic null. There was no terror, no awe, just an empty, frustrating void of static. Before the first trial commenced, custom dictated the challenger select a weapon from the ancestral vaults. To the lower chambers Kalen was sent. The room smelled of oxidized dust and forgotten metal. It was here, among the obsolete relics the hegemony kept only for mockery, that he found the founding iron. An ugly, heavy blade forged from basic kinetic materials. Elder Rolf, a hunched archivist with a flickering bioluminescence, watched the human lift the sword from its rack. "The neural abyss does not require physical steel," the elder rasped, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. "It operates as a closed resonance loop. The chamber forces your own psychic emissions back into your neural pathways. It amplifies any internal fear or regret until the cerebral cortex simply shuts down from the feedback. You cannot cut a memory, human." Kalen ran a calloused hand along the iron's dull edge. His thumb resumed its steady, rhythmic tapping against the hilt. "Good to know," he murmured, his tone flatter than the metal itself. Abruptly ended the time for preparation. Deeper into the palace they marched, descending toward the Valem crucible. The air grew cold, smelling sharply of ozone and sterile energy. Vale linked her consciousness with the gallery, anticipating the familiar, satisfying rush of a lesser mind shattering under the weight of its own inadequacies. His right hand. The chamber was a hollow sphere of obsidian glass, vibrating with a low, psionic thrum that made the marrow in Vale's bones feel liquid. As the psionic resonance loop activated, the human's mind was supposed to become a mirror, reflecting his own fears until he collapsed. Vale watched the data stream. Her consciousness expanded to witness the inevitable dissolution of this primitive ego. For 12 minutes, the gallery watched a man walk through an invisible fire. The air within the crucible began to warp. Not with heat did the atmosphere ripple, but with the sheer, agonizing density of the human's suppressed history. Vale felt the first leak, a jagged, metallic shard of a memory that tasted of sulfur and scorched iron. It was followed by a flood. Decades of unfiltered trauma, of mud-clogged trenches and the screaming of dying stars surged out from the psionic null they had mocked. Vale attempted to disconnect from the network, but the resonance loop had locked. "He isn't a null," Elder Rolf whispered, his voice trembling as he clutched the railing of the observation deck. "He is a vault." The human stood perfectly still. His thumb continued its steady, rhythmic tapping against the sword's hilt, a metronome keeping time against the chaos of his own mind. Vale caught a flash of a name. Eris, a child with chalk-stained fingers laughing in a building that was, seconds later, reduced to gray ash. The individual grief of that one lost girl hit the collective psionic network with the force of a supernova. Vale's silver eyes wept. Below in the arena, Archon Malachur's champions had seen enough. The rite of contestation demanded a duel of body, and the hegemony's finest stepped forward, a shimmering warrior whose movements were a blur of psionic perfection. The champion adjusted a small, decorative buckle on his vambrace, a routine check of a man who expected a swift execution. Kalen lunged. With a brutal, unadorned efficiency, the founding iron met the champion's energy blade. The human did not dance, he moved like a landslide. Utilizing the heavy weight of the founding iron, Kalen parried a high strike and immediately exploited a repetitive, graceful flaw in the champion's footwork, a slight overextension of the lead hip. The Archon himself descended, his fragile elegance replaced by a desperate, glowing rage. Malachur swung a psionic whip that sang with the power to sever atoms, yet Kalen simply ducked. Drawing on leaked combat recordings he had studied for months, Kalen targeted the Archon's hidden hip injury, a lingering shadow from a centuries-old skirmish. Kalen drove the founding iron through Malachur's guard. The Archon fell, his psionic aura flickering like a dying lamp. In the center of the silent arena, Kalen stood over the noble, the heavy blade inches from Malachur's throat. A single word from the arch-sovereign above would have ended the trial. Yet the sovereign remained frozen, mesmerized by the raw agency of a creature that should have been broken. Kalen looked at the blade. He looked at Lyra. Then, with a grunt of exertion, he drove the founding iron 2 feet deep into the crystal floor of the arena, the impact echoing through the palace like a closing door. The human turned his back on the Archon. High above Aurelia Prime, the sun began to dip below the gas giant's horizon, staining the glass palaces in hues of bruised purple and dying gold. The arch-sovereign descended to validate the trial. Kalen Thorne walked toward the docking bays, his boots heavy and rhythmic. Behind him, the crude slab of steel remained embedded in the crystalline floor. The polished glass was fractured, a web of white cracks spreading outward from the iron core.